What Sam Bankman-Fried can learn from Shakespeare. Bitcoin or bust. There is more in heaven and earth than is dreamt of in Sam's philosophy. Unrealistic, ridiculous, absurd, flimsy. These are not descriptions of FTX's business model, but how its disgraced founder, Sam Bankman-Fried, described the plays of the quote-unquote shitty writer, William Shakespeare. Sam cast these aspersions in a 2012 blog post titled The Fetishization of the Old, where he pounds his keyboard against not only Shakespeare, but also Stradivarius, Orson Welles, and the U.S. Constitution, all of which he considers overblown. However, it was Sam's attack on Shakespeare which generated the most ire amongst the commentariat. As a master of fiction himself, you may think that Sam is well placed to play the role of literary critic. And indeed, in the same sort of way most teenagers think their parents are morons, there is something tediously fashionable about a young, swaggering iconoclast mounting baseless attacks against such an established historical figure. Castigating the bard is very on-brand for Bankman-Fried, which is presumably why the financial writer Michael Lewis saw fit to discuss the blog in his less-than-scrupulous quasi-hagiography on him. Going Infinite. Given its subject is widely considered to be the greatest ever craftsman of the English language, the sheer wordlessness of Sam's critique is interesting in and of itself. If one thing is clear from the blog, it is that Sam is no lover of language. The piece reads like a disgruntled math student's rant against literature. One can feel Sam's resentment bubbling up from a cauldron of school-day memories, where the young whiz-kid was forced to study the bard, wasting precious time and mental energy which he could have better spent devising ingenious algorithms to steal billions of dollars. Fittingly for this jaded maths nerd, Sam's main argument against Uncle Will is a numerical one. He writes, "When Shakespeare wrote, almost all Europeans were busy farming, and very few people attended university. Few people were even literate, probably as low as 10 million people. By contrast, there are now upwards of 1 billion literate people in the Western sphere. What are the odds that the greatest writer would have been born in 1564? The Bayesian priors aren't very favorable." Now, of course, to any fan of Shakespeare, this just serves to further underline his greatness. As the poet Robert Graves put it, the most remarkable thing about Shakespeare is that he is as good as everyone says he is. As such, the smaller the statistical probability of his greatness, the greater the share of the glory. However, when Sam does veer from the path of numbers, he finds himself inevitably in the bard's territory. One of the linguistic techniques he employs to disparage Shakespeare, alongside his co-targets of Orson Welles, Stradivarius, and the founding fathers of America, is the use of the prefix "un" to negate the meaning of a usually positive adjective. Shakespeare's plays are unrealistic. Citizen Kane is unwatchable. He laments that the U.S. Constitution is unchangeable and unlikely to be overturned. It is a delicious irony, then, and one presumably unknown to Sam, that the use of "un" in this manner was introduced by another upstart innovator, namely William Shakespeare. In the interest of fair play, I will try to steel man Sam's arguments and even the man boy himself. As the literary critic Howard Bloom noted, Shakespeare helped to invent the human being in literature. His characters are complex, contradictory, introspective. His villains elicit empathy, whilst his heroes often possess sinister qualities. In that spirit, we should avoid stereotyping Sam as the sort of one-dimensional figure that he accuses Shakespeare of writing. Although, make no mistake, I come to bury Sam, not to praise him. Sam argues that we obsequiously revere Shakespeare at the expense of newer, better writers because of an inherent bias favoring the old. a bias which our culture and educational systems reinforce by dishing out the perpetual propaganda of Macbeth, Hamlet, and countless sonnets. However, if we were to pause for a moment and reflect honestly on the quality of Shakespeare's writing, we would realize that we have all been under a cultural spell and that the bard has no clothes. Sam is not wrong when he argues that, in blind tests, the sound of a modern violin is indistinguishable or even superior to a Stradivarius. If Citizen Kane were released today, it would likely bomb at the box office. To the contemporary ear, the writing of the hit series Succession is much more engaging than the impenetrable verbosity of King Lear, to which it owes so much. However, the logical conclusion of Sam's argument is that a cheap Casio wristwatch is a greater timepiece than Big Ben. After all, it is pointless in the modern age to build a single, obscenely expensive giant clock when everyone can have an affordable, 100% accurate featherlight wristwatch built with the far more sophisticated technology of silicon chips. However, call me old-fashioned, but I would struggle to argue that a $5 plastic Casio is greater than Big Ben, and that we only revere the latter because of cultural inertia. The argument ultimately hinges on what we mean by greatest. What makes something great, then? Why do we look upon an anachronistic, technologically inferior clock and feel a sense of timelessness? Timeless? Aye, there's the nub. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. Something is great because it endures, because it is both of its time and yet simultaneously transcends it. With regard to Big Ben, or Elizabeth Tower for the pedant readers, its classical symmetry and Gothic revival style speaks of ancient Greece, Renaissance Italy, and medieval English churches in one form. Its construction out of stone grounds it to deep geological time, whilst its striking clock face and imposing bells ring out the present across the seat of British democracy. Similarly, great stories are not necessarily the ones with the cleverest or most sophisticated plots or the most realistic characters. As what is considered clever or sophisticated or realistic in one era is often seen as staid, cliché, or contrived in another. What makes a story great, that is what makes it endure, is its ability to articulate a deeper, a temporal truth. Stories only survive over centuries and millennia if they resonate across the fabric of the human experience. To turn Sam's argument on its head, the sheer fact that people still read Shakespeare's plays and poems, despite the multitudinous amount of writing which has been created since, is itself evidence of their greatness. To employ a scientific metaphor more amenable to Sam's way of thinking, good stories are memes, and memes replicate in a highly competitive environment. They can only survive in the long term if they are on some level a more truthful description of long-term reality than other memes. There have been countless popular writers in history, most of whom are forgotten. When's the last time you saw an advert for a Ben Jonson play? Because though great in their own time, they were not great for all times. Shakespeare is not the greatest writer of the 2020s, nor the 1930s, nor the 1880s, but he is the greatest writer of the 2020s, 1930s, and 1880s. Underlying Sam's argument is a fallacy of progressive improvement. The notion that if things become better over time, from a utilitarian point of view, cars are better now than they were 40 years ago, then all things which come later and are more apt for the current moment are thus improvements on what came before. However, this materialistic view does not hold for artistic endeavors. What makes Shakespeare the greatest writer of all time is that he can be employed to understand any time. A key element which confers the eternal to Shakespeare's work is that he wrote in verse, predominantly iambic pentameter, where each line is comprised of 10 alternating, unstressed and stressed syllables, da-dum, 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 da-dum. But soft, What light through yonder window breaks? The rhythm of iambic pentameter mimics that of the human heartbeat. Whilst trends come and go, the pulse of humanity remains unchanged. Beyond the sound of Shakespeare, we also can employ Shakespeare's characters as insightful lenses with which to more fully understand Sam himself. Sam the human rather than Sam the scammer. Indeed, if Sam had taken the time to properly read Shakespeare rather than absurd plots and one-dimensional characters, he would have found themes and accounts which describe and indeed foreshadow his own life's arc. Instead of melting down his youth in beds of iconoclastic lust, he may have gained wisdom from those who came before him, a wisdom which may have helped him avoid his current outcast state. The character with the most obvious parallels to Sam Bankman-Fried can be found in Shakespeare's great finance play, The Merchant of Venice. The Jewish moneylender Shylock, rather than charging his usual usurious rates, offers an interest-free loan to the Venetian merchant Antonio. The only catch? If Antonio is unable to repay, Shylock is entitled to £1 of his flesh. Shakespeare here saw, what many in crypto only discovered in 2021, if you don't know where the yield is coming from, you are the yield. The play also depicts a wealthy heiress, Portia, whose hand in marriage can only be won by correctly choosing one of 3 coffins, made from gold, silver, and lead, respectively. The first suitor looks upon the gold coffin, which reads, "Who chooseth me shall gain what many men desire." However, upon opening it, he is crestfallen to find only a skull with a smug message. All that glisters is not gold. A useful vignette to have in mind when confronted with the FTX marketing spiel. The correct coffin is the one made of dull lead, a humble metal symbolizing modesty. Again, a useful motif to hold in a world of sparkling shitcoins, where Bitcoin is castigated for being dull. The inscription inside the coffin reads, "Who chooseth me must give and hazard all he hath." QED proof of work. Aside from illuminating FTX and the nature of finance, what can Shakespeare reveal about Sam the man? Here there are several contenders, all of which represent a different color of Sam's chameleonic character. Is Sam Macbeth? In Sam, we have the talented son of uber-successful parents, who is thus destined to do great things, and yet by pursuing greatness becomes corrupted, a victim of the expectations placed on him as much as his own failings. Similarly, the Scottish play begins with the talented General Macbeth receiving a prediction from 3 witches that he will become the Thane of Cawdor and then King of Scotland. Although initially skeptical when the first prediction comes true, Macbeth now believes the fate of the second to be sealed, a belief that is tempered when it is announced that King Duncan will be staying at his home. If it is fate that Macbeth will become king, and fate delivers the king to Macbeth's home, what right or even ability does Macbeth have to refuse fate by not killing Duncan and taking his crown? If chance will have me king, why, chance may crown me without my stir. Likewise, what right does Sam have to not live up to his ability and society's expectation of him to become uber-successful himself? Spoiler alert, with some gentle encouragement from his wife, Macbeth murders King Duncan and takes the crown for himself. And yet now he remembers the witches also foretold that it would not be his own children who become kings after him, but the children of his best friend Banquo. Knowing that Banquo also knows this, does Macbeth have a choice not to kill Banquo and his family before they kill him, as he did to Duncan? What is more, now Macbeth is king, he is besieged by others who wish to take the crown, leading him to commit greater and greater acts of murder in order to maintain his position. I am in blood, stepped in so far that, should I wade no more, returning were as tedious as go over. And so too must Sam, wearing an illegitimate crown of crypto and attacked by the likes of CZ at rival exchange Binance, continue to keep his Ponzi scheme going, lest he also face ruin. Shakespeare's Macbeth is a deep meditation on the contradictions of fate, ambition, free will, morality, victory, and defeat. Or perhaps there's a bit of Richard III in Sam's ambition. As tricky Richard lamented, "I who am not shaped for sportive tricks, nor to court an amorous looking glass, I, that am curtailed of this fair proportion, cheated of feature by dissembling nature. Since this earth affords no joy to me, I'll make my heaven to dream upon the crown." There is something of the classic revenge of the nerd story to the king of crypto's tale. Not blessed with beauty or brawn, and thus consigned to a gloomy adolescence, mocked and excluded by the chads and chadettes in the summer of youth, Sam must rely solely on his brains and Machiavellian ambition to gain status and admiration. To be invited to the penthouse Play Bunny pool parties, to caper nimbly in a lady's chamber. But then what of the loss of this status and the fleeing of fair weather friends when the money has vanished into thin air? Is Sam Timon of Athens, the wealthy and popular businessman who accumulated fawning acolytes by bestowing generous gifts and feasts upon them, just as Sam lavished his circle with mansions and cars and rubbed shoulders with the likes of Katy Perry, Taylor Swift, and Tom Brady? As Timon reflects, "But myself, who had the world as my confectionery, the mouths, the tongues, the eyes, and hearts of men, at duty more than I could frame employment. Yet when the money has gone, Sam, like Timon, is swiftly deserted, outcast, designated persona non grata, that numberless upon me, stuck as leaves do on the oak, have with one winter's brush fallen from their boughs, and left me open, naked, for every storm that blows." However, perhaps I am humanizing Sam Bankman-Fried too much. Despite inventing the human being in literature, Shakespeare also gave us literature's most devilish villain in Iago from Othello, whose evil scheme to ruin the titular Moorish general's life seems motivated not by ambition, jealousy, or racism, but simply for evil's sake, motiveless malignity, as Coleridge described it. Seeing the utter remorselessness of Sam in the wake of FTX collapse, one can't help but feel perhaps he was just always an agent of chaos, motivated by the thrill of destruction and subjugation, and using the mask of goodness as a ruse to gain the trust of people in order to better exploit them. The most egregious aspect of Sam's public persona was his espousal of the philosophy of effective, or more aptly effective, altruism, whereby he alleged that his primary motivation for becoming a billionaire was so he could give it all away, and thus do much more good for the world than by old-fashioned public service. This garnered him good favor with the likes of Jimmy Carter and Giselle, and even duped the famously scrutinizing philosopher Sam Harris. And yet, anyone who has read Othello would be wary of such proclamations of goodness, or of doing things for goodness' sake. They will recall that honest Iago, as he was known, used the pretense of virtue to cloak the stench of his Machiavellian schemes. But I will wear my heart upon my sleeve, for doors to peck at. I am not what I am. Indeed, it seems President Carter, Giselle, and Sam Harris had forgotten their Othello, and along with it the adage that, "When devils will the blackest sins put on." They do suggest at first with heavenly shows. Is Sam Shylock or Macbeth or Richard III or Timon of Athens or Iago? The truth is that Sam is all of these characters. The truth is that Sam is all of these characters, as one man in his time plays many parts, and all have their exits and their entrances. Now Sam has perhaps had his final exit from the world stage, sans money, sans reputation, sans freedom, sans everything. He begins and ends his blog stating, "In about 80 years, I will be dead. I will be at risk of being forgotten. I would like to think that I will be remembered." We all would. The irony is that if Sam will be remembered, it will not be as a result of his contribution to the world, but because the story of his life, his rise, hubris, deceit, and downfall were all positively Shakespearean. Even this article in describing Sam Bankman-Fried uses at least 30 words and phrases coined by the bard, which are still used to this day as common currency, which is more than one can say about FTX token.